What's up, everybody? Welcome back to our Phases of Kratom Addiction Recovery series. So last week we talked about the pink cloud, and this week we're going to get into long-term kratom recovery, which is also called post-acute withdrawal syndrome. And what does this look like? What was my experience? What this could look like for you, and some different things that can help during this. So I've gone into this quite a bit here on this channel because I found that in my recovery process that the post-acute withdrawal stuff that I was experiencing in my long-term kratom recovery was a lot harder than anything else that I had gone through during my recovery. It definitely was harder than the acute withdrawals. It definitely was harder than the quitting process itself. Because for me, when I got into that long-term recovery, like pretty much the year and a half after I quit, that was really when it got tough, where I didn't know how long it was going to last. I didn't know if I had done permanent damage to my brain and to my body. I didn't know if what I was experiencing was normal too, like, if anybody else had ever gone through it. I didn't know if like that was just how was gonna be, where like the symptoms that I was experiencing in the post-acute withdrawal stuff was just like my new normal. So it was really hard. And I've shared before that my recovery process was a really long one. It was super tough. Like my post-acute withdrawal phase in the long-term recovery lasted for a year and a half. And so what this meant is that like I quit, and then I had my pink cloud phase for maybe 2-3 weeks. And then I started to get into that post-acute withdrawal, and it lasted for a solid year and a half. And so I had a lot of time on my hands to think about things and to try to make sense of things. And so I learned a lot through this. And there's been, I think, 2 or 3 videos where I've shared about it. And then we did a whole study in our daily devotional series where we went into like different aspects of what it meant to be in this wilderness, is what I call it, of long-term recovery. And so what's going on like on a neurochemical level when we're in this phase? So when we have any addiction, especially kratom, because it does affect our brains so much, our brains and our bodies get used to the neurochemicals that are going on when we take kratom. And dopamine is one of those neurochemicals, and it is responsible for feelings of pleasure, contentment, motivation, excuse me. And so when we're taking kratom, we're basically getting all this unearned dopamine because that's what's created in our brains when we take the kratom. And so after we quit kratom, our brains and our bodies need a chance to heal, because depending on how long your addiction was and how much kratom you were taking, our brains become dependent on the kratom to have this dopamine. And then there comes a point too in our addiction where we don't even really have much of that dopamine response when we even take the kratom. So, that's an aspect too to like why addiction really doesn't work. So as we are going through the process of quitting, and then we do our final quit and we get to the point where we're in our long-term recovery, our brains and our bodies are healing after that addiction. And so the normal production of dopamine in our brains has been affected. And it takes a while to heal and get back to normal. And that's really like the technical aspect of what PAWS is. And I think we just said it, but just to say it again, PAWS is short for post-acute withdrawal syndrome. And that is our long-term recovery process. So like, what does this look like? We have this going on in our brains and our bodies. And like, what does this look like on a real level with how we're feeling and how it's affecting our daily life? A lot of times it translates into feelings of depression, anxiety, Excuse me for clearing my throat. I'm getting over a cold still, so I apologize about that. Anhedonia is a big factor for a lot of us, where anhedonia means the inability to feel pleasure from anything. And that's one of the symptoms that's experienced a lot when we are in long-term kratom recovery. And, there can be other stuff that goes on where, we don't feel motivated at all. We feel super fatigued. We could still be very sensitive to different things, stimuli, stress, things like that. So as our brain chemistry is healing, there are going to be these symptoms that go on. How this affects our daily life is that this creates a really hard time for a lot of us, where we have quit kratom and now we're in this expanse of space and time that we have no idea how long it's going to last. And like I was saying, for me, it was like the hardest part of my recovery because, for some people, it can last a couple months. For some people, they don't even experience any sort of post-acute withdrawal syndrome. So if that's you, that is totally awesome. And I have talked to people who didn't even experience anything like the post-acute symptoms. But for a lot of us, it's a very real part of our recovery. And, it's really difficult. For me, I didn't have any motivation to do things. I would have to force myself to do the most mundane tasks, and everything just seemed meaningless. I had this very flat, gray, empty feeling that just washed over everything in my life, my perception, anything that I would do, it felt forced. I didn't really feel any pleasure, excuse me again for clearing my throat, feel any pleasure from anything for a really long time, where the normal things that I loved, spending time with my husband or my son, my love of food, my love of the outdoors, my love of music. I really didn't feel any joy from any of that stuff for a long time. And so that's how it looked for me personally, but it can take on many forms for different people. What was my personal experience like? Like I was just saying, there were a couple things that I explained, but to go over it in detail, my post-acute withdrawal stuff started to set in about 2 to 3 weeks after the pink cloud phase for me. So I had quit kratom and I went through my acute withdrawal phase that lasted about 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most for just some of the lingering symptoms. And then the pink cloud phase started and lasted about 3 weeks at the most. And so then that was about almost 2 months after I quit, where the onset of the post-acute withdrawal symptoms started to set in. And how that looked was the anhedonia really started to set in during that time, where everything just kind of washed out to this sort of gray feeling over everything in my life. It wasn't this instantaneous thing that I was able to recognize. It was a gradual shift from the high of the pink cloud to this kind of settling into this new sort of gray feeling, basically. And I started to experience a lot more depression, where it was this deep sadness that would kick in, and anxiety that would also take over. I ended up quitting coffee 3 months after I quit kratom because of this reason, where as the anxiety started to come in with the post-acute symptoms, I noticed that I knew that coffee wasn't working for me for a long time, but it was during this time specifically where I just knew that it was not going to work anymore to drink coffee, because I would drink coffee and I would have this full body reaction where I would go my adrenaline would kick in. It would basically bring on panic attacks. I would get covered in sweat. I wouldn't be able to really rationalize anything. And so I knew that it wasn't going to work to just keep drinking coffee. And it was really because of the onset of those post-acute withdrawal symptoms where I started to have a lot more anxiety and panic attacks and that kind of thing. So that's how it also set in and started to look like. What did it look like in the long term? Like I said, I went through this for 1.5 years, and it was a very, very long 1.5 years. And it settled into just this place of like uncertainty and my faith being completely challenged and tested, because I had gone through this like renewal of my faith during my tapering and my quitting process. And then when I got into this phase of the recovery, it was like really when like the rubber had to meet the road for my faith, because I had these awesome experiences during my taper and then my final quit where I felt so connected to God and like felt this amazing like renewal and rebirth of my faith. And then when I got into this territory of the long-term recovery and all this post-acute stuff, like it was really hard to still feel connected to my faith when I was going through these challenges. Day turned into night and night turned into day, and it was just this expansive space and time that felt completely meaningless and hopeless at different moments. I knew I was never going back to Kratom. I knew it, but I didn't know how long this was going to last, and part of me didn't know if I was going to even get through it, because at least with Kratom, there were the ups and the downs, and the ups kind of gave me a break from like, all the depths and the darkness and stuff of like, the downside of the addiction. But in the post-acute withdrawal stuff, it was just like this expanse. And I was also going through grief at that time that I had put off when I was in my Kratom addiction. So it was like compiling with everything. And a lot of us experience where we're in our long-term recovery, where it's like our addictions, I equate it and I like have this idea in my mind that like when we have these addictions, it's like throwing a wet blanket over our problems, our past traumas, hard stuff that we're going through at the time. PTSD symptoms from things that we had been through before. And when we take that wet blanket off, which is our Kratom addiction, it's like we are staring face to face with things that have happened to us that we've never dealt with. A lot of us that end up on Kratom or in other addictions come from hard childhoods, abuse, neglect, trauma, complex trauma, which is like traumatic things that happen over and over again. And so, we're a lot of times using these addictions as a way to cope and still function in the world. And when we remove this thing that kind of numbs these things that have happened to us, we have to, it's like a reckoning, like we have to stand face to face with things that are extremely painful. And that was something that happened in my post-acute withdrawal symptoms where like I was so raw, meaning like everything hurt so much more. And I don't mean that just on a physical level. I mean that on like an emotional and a mental level, where not only am I navigating this grief, but I'm also having like all of these repressed memories and triggers from abuse and trauma that I had gone through like when I was a kid. And it just brought it all up to the surface. And it was this reckoning where I had to face these things that had happened to me, that I had been putting off for, pretty much my whole life. And I've heard it before as I've studied trauma, that there is this point in time as adults that we reach where we basically can't like ignore the things that have happened to us anymore. And a lot of times it happens in our mid 30s to into our 40s, where like our minds have matured as adults to the point where there is this like dichotomy and this juxtaposition that happens in our brains where the things that have happened to us, now that we're mature enough to understand them, there's this conflict where we know that what has happened is wrong. And in our mature adult mind, it's basically this like coming to terms with and acknowledging the things that have happened to us, so then we can hopefully accept, grieve, heal, integrate, whatever way you want to explain it, these things that have happened to us. So then we're able to move forward, and it isn't this source of pain that's causing these trauma responses through PTSD symptoms and whatnot like that, and the resurfacing of memories and those kind of things. So I experienced this because I was in my late 30s when I quit Kratom. And so it might have been, just the age where I was at. And then it was compiled with actually quitting this substance that I was using to numb the pain. And so I had this whole like reckoning process when I went through my post-acute withdrawal stuff, where like I had to face the traumas that I had gone through. And it was really tough. You may come from a situation where you had a great upbringing, you've had a pretty good life. There hasn't really been anything too terrible that's happened to you. And so maybe you're not going to go through this at all in your long-term recovery process. But I do know, because I've talked to a lot of you guys who are also dealing with trauma and complex trauma, childhood stuff, all that kind of thing. And we've talked about it one-on-one about how the recovery process has brought this stuff up for you. So it's something that I wanted to bring up because it was something that was a huge part of my experience. So how did this end up playing out? Over this year and a half, as I was navigating all of these different things that were coming to the surface, and, the unknowing of if I had caused permanent damage to my brain and body because of this addiction, I ended up learning some very valuable lessons, and it actually taught me so much. And it was very difficult, but if I had the choice to go back and do it again, I would do it again, because I learned and I grew so much as a person during this process. So over the year and a half, there were a lot of amazing lessons that I learned. And these are some of the things that I'm going to share with you now about the things that I learned, and then also what helped me in this process. So I learned, as I was mentioning before, what true faith was. I learned that in my darkest moments and in my hardest times, that my faith was something that I could turn to and to have strength and comfort when I didn't have it on my own. I know that some of you are coming from a place where you don't either believe in God, or, there are different aspects about your personal situation that you may not be open to faith. So I totally respect that. How you can equate that in a sense that isn't faith-based is that, it really builds personal endurance and personal strength. When you're able to keep going through something that's difficult, and no matter how hard it gets, you stick with your decision to be done with Kratom and to never go back to it, this cultivates personal strength and personal endurance. So that's something that's outside of the faith spectrum that can apply to you. One of the things that it really did for me, and one of the greatest lessons that I drew from this process, was that I learned real patience. And I was almost 40 years old when I went through that process, and I still had not learned real patience. And in the culture that we live in, and just like the nature of technology and the world that's around us, we're so used to instant gratification with everything. Where we have Amazon Prime delivered to us in a day or two. We have everything at the click of a finger on our phone screen, all of this information, all of these answers that come to us immediately. We put stuff in the microwave and it's warmed up in 2 minutes. So I feel like we're wired for just instant gratification. And learning true patience is a virtue that is invaluable. And I wouldn't have learned that if I didn't go through this process. So that was something that I gained too. Another thing that I learned, and a lesson that I still carry now, is that like this gave me so much insight into like myself. This is when I started to study this stuff, you guys. Like, I'm super passionate, obviously, about faith, but like I also have a component of me that's very logical and that's very interested in like science and biology and neurochemistry, how the brain works, how the body works, you know, the science of addiction. And that's when I started to really dig into that, was during this time of my recovery. And it was so sweet because it gave me this insight into like my brain and my body that I would not normally be able to see, because, you know, I'm feeling this way. I'm living this out. I'm living the anhedonia. I'm living the depression. And so when I started to like, you know, wasn't this like, I'm going to just like buy, you know, a textbook about neurochemistry and try to dive in. It wasn't like that. I literally just started listening to podcasts. And that started to open my mind to like, okay, like this is what's going on in my brain. This is why I'm feeling this way. Like, this is completely normal. And I am in this healing process that is 100% necessary. And though it sucks, it needs to happen. So if you'd like to check out some of the cool podcasts that I listened to throughout my recovery process, I made a playlist here on my channel called Understanding Addiction. And there's some really sweet podcasts, interviews, resources, just little videos with like nuggets of wisdom and like the explanation of this whole like scientific aspect of addiction, if you want to check it out. So that was one of the things that I gained, was like, you know, even though I was in pain, I became very introspective in the sense of that, like, it motivated me to try to figure out why I was feeling the way that I was feeling. So what are some of the things that helped me? Like I said, patience. We can't rush this process. It's going to take as long as it needs to take, and sometimes it's going to take a while. And so really just digging our boot heels in the ground and going, we're not going back to our addiction. We're going to ride this storm out as long as it takes, is really important. Also, a completely crucial element of this is that you need to understand that it's not going to last forever. No matter how hard it is, no matter how long it takes, it is not going to last forever. And I promise you that. Some of the actual things that I did that helped me during this process were, I was eating in a way that nourished my body. So everybody has different opinions about what to eat and what's the healthiest way to eat, and that's cool. I respect everybody's opinions, and I've eaten every single way. Excuse me, coming from the hippie background, I did the whole vegan, vegetarian, raw vegan, like all that stuff, and so I had learned from those experiences, and it actually led me to the way that I eat still to this day, and it was a huge component of me healing my body, and that is eating a diet that's based on nutrient-dense foods like meat, seafood, eggs, and then I eat about 70% of my diet is those foods, and then I eat about 30% fruit and vegetables, and I'm pretty selective about the types that I eat. So it's mostly like the 30% is mostly like sweet potatoes, and I'll do a little bit of citrus fruit when I need some energy. But my diet was a huge component of this, and being nutrient dense, it really helps to heal my brain and my body. I also supplemented with liposomal vitamin C, and I took that in large doses, so around 6,000 milligrams a day. I also, still to this day, love, and I take it every single night, and I'm a huge advocate for it, which is magnesium. Excuse me again for clearing my throat. And so magnesium helped with a lot of things, and so I took that. I take vitamin D, I take vitamin K2, I take a little bit of iodine. I soak with Epsom salt, which is also magnesium, in baths, and so that was a big part of my healing process. One of the things that really helps too is complete abstinence. And what that means is no kratom under any circumstances ever. Because what happens is if you take even the smallest amount of kratom, it's going to restart this whole process again. And, you know, the healing process of your brain getting back to normal where it can create its own dopamine is going to be completely halted even if you take the smallest amount of kratom. So complete abstinence. Like I mentioned, it sucks, but quitting coffee was really helpful. I also quit refined sugar, which doing all these things, the coffee, the sugar, changing my diet, all of that just helped to put my body in a place where it was able to heal. And so that's why I did that. Exercise was a huge component. I got into weightlifting. I'm not a bodybuilder, but just like very simple, like 20-pound weight, excuse me, doing exercises at home. And that gave me also a sense of accomplishment, and it like helps with your endorphins and that kind of thing. Going outside and getting fresh air was really important. Setting small goals and accomplishing them every single day, no matter how small, even if it's just making your bed, doing the dishes, taking a shower, you know, doing very small goals and accomplishing them. And one of the things that helped a lot too, which I think I'm going to get into in its own separate video, is doing a dopamine detox. And there's actually, I think there's a couple videos in my Understanding Addiction playlist here on my channel. But basically, it's where you limit sources that create a dopamine response in your brain, and it helps for your brain to rewire. So, excuse me, I'm sorry, I keep doing this. I'm getting over the cold, so I apologize. And as you know, I don't edit these videos, so what you see is what you get. So at the end of things, slowly but surely, the anhedonia lifted. Slowly but surely, I started to feel more joy from simple things again. And then after that 1.5 year mark, in probably the next 6 months to follow, I started to see this shift where things lifted. And I started to be happier. I started to take on more commitments and set bigger goals for myself. And then in the year to follow, after that 1.5 years of the long-term recovery, I really worked on setting these goals and reclaiming and rebuilding in my life what I had lost to my addiction. So that's the next phase that we're going to get into next week. And let us know in the comment section below if you're going through post-acute withdrawal stuff and what your long-term recovery looks like from Kratom if you're in it now. And so I'll see you next week when we get into the rebuilding and the reclaiming. All right, see you then, guys. Bye.